All right, last lecture of the semester. We made it. Now, our last lecture, we talked about the impacts that humans have had on the natural world and the biodiversity of the natural world. And it was kind of a bad story. And I didn't want to end the semester on such a low note. So today we're going to be talking about the things that humans can do, and in fact are doing, to preserve biodiversity. The first question we should ask ourselves is, why do we even bother? What are the things about biodiversity that make it valuable to humankind? And the arguments for preserving biodiversity fall into basically three categories. The first is we get stuff from nature, right? Direct human benefits. Right? This is sort of the Teddy Roosevelt type of argument. The second is that intact ecosystems and natural ecosystems provide services that we benefit from, things like photosynthesis, for example. Right? As it stands right now, the Amazon rainforest provides fully 1/5 of all photosynthesis on Earth. So that means if we lose the Amazon, that is 20% of the oxygen that's not being produced. And the last argument is that nature's nice, right? And that it has its own intrinsic worth. So direct benefits include things like natural resources like fish and trees, but it also includes things like drugs. Scientists have been able to extract compounds from natural organisms from which we can derive pharmaceutical drugs. Right? This is Taxol. And Taxol is a drug that's used to treat breast and ovarian cancers. And it's derived from the Pacific yew tree, which is endangered. Right? And you can imagine a situation that if we had ever lost that tree, we wouldn't have this drug to treat these breast and ovarian cancers. Right? And that's all well and good when you can look at it in retrospect. Oh yes, it's obvious that we should have saved the Pacific yew because we can get drugs from that. But there are a lot of things out there in nature that are not necessarily obvious that they're important. Right? So for example, this right here, this plant right here, is something called teosinte. And if just looking at that, you wouldn't think that it's necessarily that important, and you wouldn't really freak out if it's were endangered or threatened with extinction. However, teosinte is the raw material from which corn was domesticated. Right? So it's not obvious that teosinte is that important, but it is the root material that people used to domesticate corn, which has become the most important crop on Earth. It's not just the species that are important, right? Sometimes the genes are important. We talked about the notothenoid fish that has that antifreeze protein. So there's genetic variation within species that are also valuable for preservation. Second main argument for the preservation of natural resources in nature is the ecosystem services. Right? Things like filtration of water, storm control, photosynthesis. These are all things that nature does as a matter of course when it's an intact ecosystem. But we are starting to understand that as we damage these ecosystem services break down. And so what we're starting to see is the recognition that intact ecosystems provide a sort of status quo that is necessary for human existence. And then the third argument for the preservation of nature is that it's nice. Those of you who spend some time outdoors, camping or hiking or skiing even, surfing, right? Nature is nice. And it sort of speaks to us on a level that's beyond economics or science. But as we learned last lecture, although extinction is a normal part of life, there have been mass extinction events throughout Earth's history, and we are in the midst of the sixth great mass extinction caused by human activities, things like habitat loss and overexploitation, climate change. So the impact that we're having on the environment is very dire, it's very significant, it's very extreme. And then we discussed a little bit about why the situation is the way it is, right? Our economic sort of systems are not built to sort of value nature in situ. It's only built to value nature as a resource, right? And when it comes to scientific conclusions that sort of indicate that we need to change the way we do things, we're at a situation where it's too easy to ignore, right? Like, with all this data that's suggesting that climate change is real and significant and potentially disastrous, right? The conclusion that you can draw from this is that we need to sort of draw down our dependence on fossil fuels. But because our entire world economy runs on fossil fuels, there are a lot of very powerful interests that don't want to accept that change needs to occur. Right. And one of the arguments that they use very commonly is, well, how do you know that all this bad stuff is going to happen? Right? And to this, I would reply, it's better to be safe than sorry. Right? There's a basic phenomenon, or sort of a principle called the precautionary principle, which is if the substantial evidence suggests that there's going to be bad effects, we probably shouldn't see if that is the case. We should probably maybe take some measures now to abate even the potential for bad consequences. Right? It's like saying, if you were to drive a car off a cliff, are you 100% sure you're going to die? And the answer is no, you're not 100% sure. But even just our best evidence suggests that you're going to do some serious damage to yourself, if not death. And so we don't drive cars off cliffs. In a similar way, all these things, all these negative impacts that humans are having on the environment suggest that there are going to be some very, very dire consequences. And as a precaution, we should start to disengage from those bad practices and start to think about nature in a different way. And this is where conservation comes in. The term conservation biology refers to all of the efforts that are being taken to preserve nature. Right? And this is not just science. There's policy decisions, economic decisions, education. All of these play into conservation efforts. But fundamentally, conservation efforts operate within a system, right? Within a system of government, within an economic framework. And as a consequence, it really needs to span a lot of disciplines, not just science, but also politics. It also needs to make considerations for economics. One of the first things that conservation biologists need to do is identify where they want to divert most of their efforts. The fact of the matter is the world is very variable, highly variable in the number of species, in the way the species are distributed around the world. Right? We already discussed that the tropics, for example, have much higher species than the tundra, for example. Right? Furthermore, there are certain areas of the world that are more threatened than others. There are some parts of the world that have species that are found only there. Right? These types of species are called endemic species. So taking all this into consideration, conservation biologists have identified various hotspots around the world. These are areas that are under threat, that have a high number of endemic species, so if we lose them there, we're never going to see them again, and which have a high degree of species diversity. It's basically like triage. Triage, if you're not aware, is the triage nurse is the first person you see when you go to the ER. Right? And the triage nurse will decide whether or not you need immediate attention, or if you're, you can afford to wait a few hours, or you're so far beyond saving that even if a doctor were to see you now, you're going to die anyway. Right? It's the triage nurse that decides what's where the medical attention could best be applied. In a similar way, conservation biologists have identified these hotspots. These are the areas around the world that need the immediate attention, that would benefit the most from the attention that they can bring. So how is conservation done? Well, basically, there's a lot of ways that conservation efforts can be categorized, right? But I'm going to basically describe 3 levels of conservation strategies. Right? These levels have to do with how much humans are involved. So in the first level, preservation, humans just set aside lands. They don't touch it, they don't develop it. Right? So this is very minimal human contact. Mixed use conservation is actually allowing development to occur. So right, humans can develop these areas, but it promotes efforts to exist harmoniously within natural ecosystems. And then the last is restoration, and this is basically humans repairing damaged ecosystems. And so restoration naturally represents the highest amount of human involvement. So in preservation, you just set aside large tracts of land for nature to run its course. You restrict human activities so that natural things can just happen. If you've ever heard of an agency called the Nature Conservancy, one of the things about them is that they just will ask you for money. They will never stop asking you for money. All right, and what they do with this money is they buy up large tracts of land, and then they just leave it. Right? Because we discussed last lecture about the tragedy of the commons, right? If there's a common resource, it tends to get abused and overworked. But if, like the Nature Conservancy, can buy a large tract of land, that tract of land becomes not a commons resource anymore. It belongs to the Nature Conservancy, and they can dictate what happens on that land. And what they want to have happen is nothing. So that's why they need so much money, is they're buying up huge tracts of land. There are some other areas in the world that are naturally really have low human populations where nature tends to thrive. Right? Ironically, they tend to be in war zones. So, for example, the DMZ along the 38th parallel between North and South Korea is very, very rich in biodiversity. Nature's really doing fine. Aside from the occasional deer stepping on a landmine, but by and large, nature is doing very well. Right? And the other place, which might surprise you, is Chernobyl. Right? So after the nuclear accident in the 80s in the Ukraine, right, Chernobyl basically is uninhabitable for humans, but wildlife has actually recovered. And so basically the rule is when humans aren't involved, nature tends to be able to recover very well. Mixed use is when humans interact with the environment, but they do it in a sustainable or intelligent way. Right? There are some really good examples of facilities being built in concert with natural processes. I think probably the best example I can think of off the top of my head is the Apple facility in Cupertino. Right? So before Apple expanded its campus, they did a very, very extensive analysis of the area and the natural processes in that area. And when they started to expand their campus, they try to use the greenest materials, try not to affect things like water flow and nutrient flow within their little valley. Right. Another example of mixed use is the harvesting of rainforest, right? So we discussed the rainforest and why it's so difficult to harvest the rainforest. Once you cut the trees, whether for the logs or whether you burn the materials, the soil loses its fertility because so much rain falls and it washes all the materials away. Right. So upon hearing this, you might think that it's impossible to then harvest the rainforest, but you would be wrong, actually. If you understand the problem is when you have an exposed area, all this material will just leach away. When the rain comes, you just create a situation where that never happens. So you could harvest the logs alongside the hill. So now this area is barren, right? So these materials will leach down, but they're going to leach downhill where there are still trees, right? So these trees will then pick up the nutrients, and so the nutrients stay within the rainforest. Right? So you cut here, you plant new trees, and as they start to grow, they become little saplings. Then the next year you cut up here, right? So the saplings are able to absorb the nutrients that flow down from the higher part of the hill. And so the point is that if you understand natural processes, you can extract natural resources in a sustainable way. But it requires an understanding of the ecosystem and how it functions. If you go in there with the motivation that you're going to make the most money you can from that natural resource, you're really generally not thinking about the sustainability. And the last level of human involvement is restoration. Right? This almost always involves the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and this is when you fix a problem that you created. Right? It's hugely expensive usually, and generally it's necessary because prior human activities have destroyed some sort of natural process that is essential, and that's why you have to restore it. One of the example I can give you is the Kissimmee River in Florida. Right, so normally a river flows like this, something called a alluvial fan. Right, so all this area down here is called the floodplain, and it's very flat land, and it's highly desirable for developers because there's no hills and the soil is very fertile. So what developers did in Kissimmee, Florida was they created a channel. They straightened the Kissimmee River, right, so that they could have access to the floodplains to develop things. The problem is this straight line meant the water flowed really, really quickly, and it created sedimentation problems downstream, basically choked up all the fisheries downstream. And they realized that that alluvial fan was necessary for those downstream communities. So the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had to go in and artificially recreate the alluvial fan to slow the flow of the river. So they had to sort of re-engineer a natural system. So one of the things that we're going to see over the next 100 years or so, or even in the rest of your lifetimes, is a necessity to adopt new technologies. The fact of the matter is the status quo is simply not sustainable. Right? We're facing a situation where oil, the known deposits of oil, are going to run out in about 50 years. Right? And truthfully speaking, we're going to have to shift away from oil way before we run out of it. Right? Because at a certain point, it's going to become so rare, it's going to become too expensive to use as a fuel source, which means we're going to have to adopt new technologies, things like renewable sources of energy. Right? Solar, for example. Right? So the typical solar that you think of is the thing on your calculator. It's called a photovoltaic cell. Right? But new technologies, new solar technologies include things like this. This is called something called a concentrated solar platform, those are all mirrors that are flashing their light onto this tower. It gets super, super, super hot. It boils water. That boiled water then powers a steam turbine to generate electricity. Right. You may have seen a large-scale CSP project on the way to Las Vegas. Right. There's 3 massive towers with huge fields of mirrors around them. That facility is called Ivanpah. Ivanpah. Right. And it is one of these CSP facilities. Right. Wind is also a potential source of electrical energy. There are wind turbines. The wind turbine technology is advancing. Right, you may have seen a wind farm on the way to Palm Springs, or up in Northern California in Livermore. Right, but these new technologies are really going to have to come online, and if we're ever going to be in a situation where we're able to sort of get away from those old practices that have been so damaging to the environment. Another potential fuel source is switchgrass. Right? Biofuels. Right? We discussed biofuels, right? You basically grow a crop, and as that crop photosynthesizes, it's pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere and creating high-energy organic molecules, which you can then burn as a fuel source. Right? And the first time that this was tried was with corn. Right? And the problem with that is that corn is also a food. So if you try to power the energy sector using corn, it's going to basically drive the price of corn way, way, way up. Right? So some scientists, in fact, President Bush 43, his presidential science advisor was a strong advocate for using something called switchgrass, which is basically a weed, and it grows faster than corn. Nobody eats it. And in fact, you can actually get a higher ratio of energy from switchgrass than you can from corn. Right? But people have taken it one better. Right? Scientists have discovered another source of biofuels, and that's algae. Algae, under the right conditions, will grow way faster than even switchgrass will. Right? And people are getting really clever about these new technologies and what they can bring to the table in terms of conservation efforts. Right, this is a facility in France that has a lot of stages. So basically, there's the natural world basically runs in cycles. The waste products from one operation become the raw materials for the next operation. Right? But typically, human functions are not like that. Human systems are not like that. So conservationists have basically tried to adopt some of that cyclical operation. Right? So what you're seeing here is this facility in France, like I said, that takes trash, right? And it separates the trash into the biodegradable parts and the recyclable parts. The recyclable parts, they simply recycle. The biodegradable parts, they compost. Right? And composting, if you're not aware, is basically it's a controlled rot. Right? And as those things decompose, those biodegradable materials become fertilizer. Right? But the byproduct of this is methane. But these guys capture the methane and then they burn it. They use the methane as a fuel source for a joint heating and electricity facility. But when you burn the methane, it produces CO2. They capture the CO2 and they blow it into these algae tanks. That's what you're seeing here, these bubbles are CO2 being blown into the algae pond. Right? And CO2 to algae is food, right? That's the raw material that algae will use for photosynthesis. And so that helps the algae to grow higher, and then they use the algae to make biofuels. Right? So I think the point I'm trying to get across here is that people can be very, very clever when they need to be. And I think increasingly we're starting to see that people need to be creative to address some of these global issues. It's not just the technology that needs to change, it's the way we think about things, our economies, our economic system. This man right here, his name is Muhammad Yunus. Right? And if you have a moment this summer, he's written a book called Banker to the Poor, in which he suggests that our financial systems are partly to blame for societal inequities as well as environmental problems. Right? His argument is that if you take a $2 billion foreign investment, so Germany wants to invest in Chad, let's say, right? Largely how this works is that Chad will say, we need more power, more electricity for our people. And Germany says, yeah, we can do that. And they'll contact Siemens, which is a German, it's a huge German company that does a lot of electrical projects. And they will construct a massive dam, let's say, right, to the tune of $2 billion. Muhammad Yunus is suggesting that, no, rather than doing that, take the $2 billion and distribute it among the people where it will have a much greater effect. You can see here, these are women, I think they're Bangladeshi, they have a solar panel. Right? This allows them to have access to electricity even though there's no grid. This thing right here is a solar oven. Right? In many parts of the world, women spend hours of their day collecting firewood to cook. Right? And that causes deforestation around populated areas. But it also means that women are sort of, for lack of a better word, just enslaved by their daily chores. Right? But if they had a solar oven, this parabolic mirror, which directs the sunlight to this cooking vessel, right, they don't have to spend all those hours collecting fuel, and the forests in the surrounding areas won't be so depleted. We also need to really address this population problem. Right? As you can see here, this is exponential growth, and one of the things we learned about exponential growth, it is not sustainable. That it needs to it'll eventually either peter off, or we're going to exceed carrying capacity to the point that we're going to completely destroy the Earth's ability to sustain us. And honestly, studies have shown that the simplest way to address human population growth is to provide educational and economic opportunities for women. Right? The more equal societies in the world tend to have lower birth rates, as women have more opportunities and more education. Their birth rates tend to go down. Right? And this is something that is realistically doable, right? If we just had a society that was more equitable towards women, we would see dramatic payoffs in terms of population growth. We also need to address our economic systems. First and foremost, the fact that we don't value ecosystems, natural ecosystems. We only value the products that we can get out of this. Right? A forest itself has no value, but the trees of the forest do, and this encourages the exploitation of these natural resources. Furthermore, there's a significant gap between the developed world and the developing world. Right? When I was in Cameroon, we would see these trucks coming out of the forest carrying these logs. Right, and they would come out of the forest at a rate of about one truck every 40 seconds or so, 24 hours a day. Right, so the deforestation rates in Cameroon are extremely high. However, all those trucks are going to Douala, which is the port city, and they're being loaded up onto ships and being carried to the developed world. So it's the consumption of the developed world that's leading to the exploitation of the resources in the developing world. Right? And you can understand that this creates a situation where there's a lot of hypocrisy, right? Where the developed nations that have benefited from all this exploitation are now saying to the developing nations, whoa, you have to stop your resource exploitation. Just to give you an illustration of how messed up this situation can get. This flower right here is called the rosy periwinkle. And it's the Eli Lilly company, which is a big pharmaceutical company, has found a compound in this periwinkle that allowed them to make this drug for breast and ovarian cancers called vincristine or vinblastine. It's the same drug. So vincristine, vinblastine nets the Lilly company about $100 million. This rosy periwinkle is native to Madagascar, which is one of the most impoverished nations on Earth. That also happens to be one of those biodiversity hotspots. There are extremely endemic animals in Madagascar. All the lemurs, for example, are only in Madagascar. But it's also very, very heavily deforested. And so companies like Eli Lilly and Merck and Pfizer and Sanofi Pasteur are constantly going to Madagascar and saying, whoa, you got to stop your deforestation because your forests are very valuable for the medicines that they can provide. Right? But how much of this $100 million do you think goes back to Madagascar? And the answer is none, right? And so you can see there's a lot of hypocrisy, and there are some very significant changes that need to be made in our basic economic system, right? So when you look at deforestation rates around the world, you're going to see that tropical areas have a very, very high rates of deforestation. And you might look at places like France and the UK and say, oh, wow, you guys are doing great. When in fact they are not, right? Their consumptive rates, their consumption comes from places like this. This brings us to a phenomenon called globalization. Every time the G20 meets, the G20, if you're not aware, is basically the 20 largest economies in the world will gather together periodically to make economic decisions, right? But the phenomenon of this is called globalization. Right? Any sort of $5 T-shirt that you have, just look at where it's made. You're going to see that's made in Vietnam or Bangladesh or China. Right? A lot of the products that you have around you are all made in foreign countries, and poor foreign countries. The reason this is the case is so that the wealthy corporations are able to get cheap labor to provide goods to you, the consumer, at a lower cost. Right? So you can see that you are benefiting because you have a low-cost product. The corporations are benefiting because they are making more profits. Right? But fundamentally, it's the workers that are suffering. Right? And these workers are always in the developing world. So these girls right here are making, I don't know what they're making, some sort of cloth. Okay, your $5 T-shirt, let's say. Right? Your $5 T-shirt that's made in Bangladesh is made in a facility like this. Right? And what kind of opportunities do you think these girls have? What kind of life do you think they live? Right? This is the net effect of globalization. It encourages the exploitation of the developing world, not just the natural resources, but also the people, for the consumption of the developed world. So the point is, it's not just biology. You need to pay attention to a lot of different things. You need to pay attention to the politics, geopolitics, global affairs. You need to pay attention to international economics. And I know it all seems like just beyond the scope of, you have your own things to worry about, right? But the fact of the matter is it can be broken down into just a couple of small things. Number one, getting information. You live in a generation that has access to basically all human knowledge. Right? So there's really no excuse to not be educated. The facts are out there. Right? The unfortunate thing right now is that there's so much information out there that a lot of it is BS, right? And so you guys have to be sort of sift through the the falseness in order to extract the real truth. But I do think that people are getting more savvy to information, right? So I think information and education underlies all good decision making. Number two, share what you know with other people, right? And I don't mean teaching here in the sense that you have to become a teacher, but share what you know with your parents or with your children, right? My son, when he was a baby, he would go through these milk cartons like mad, right? And we would save them to recycle them, and then he didn't really understand what recycling was, so I took him to Cal State Long Beach's recycling facility, and I showed him, right? And I told them that they're going to turn these bottles into other materials like fleece. So if you have a fleece jacket, a Polartec fleece jacket, it's made from the HDPE plastic containers, the polyethylene plastic containers. Right? So now he knows that. So teaching is a really important part of this education. So get the facts, share the facts. But what we do with it is also very important. Number three is vote. Get involved politically. Right? The fact of the matter is, as you can see, you've probably gathered, that the issues that we have are going to require policy changes. Right? And it's not scientists that do the policy changes, it's politicians that do the policy changes. And this is why I think being active politically is so important. One of my hugest pet peeves in life is people who have an opinion about, like, oh, they complain about the government, they complain about this, and they complain about that, but then they don't vote. Right? If you don't vote, you don't bitch. That's the rule. All right? The fact of the matter is, politicians do not care about people. Right? A cynical person will say that they care about money, which is also not true. What they care about is voters. If voters all move in a particular direction, the politicians will as well. Right? Politicians are basically not political leaders, but really political followers. But it is important that you are involved in politics. But the thing that you can do every day is conscientious consumption. Almost all of the problems that we see environmentally come from hyper-consumption by the developed world. Think about all the food that you eat compared to all the food that's available throughout the world, right? How can you eat so much meat when, and knowing how costly it is ecologically, when there are places in the world where people are starving, right? How is it that you can, change your cell phone every 2 years when people in the developing world, don't even have electricity? The fact of the matter is, you are a consumption machine. Right? Our country, our society is just geared towards consumption. So the next time you buy something, think about whether you really need it. Think about where it came from. Right? Because basically, when you put down $1 to buy a product, you are telling a company that you approve of this product. Right? So getting educated is hugely important if the world is ever going to change. Right? And I don't want to end this semester being all preachy, but I want you to understand that these problems are not bigger than you. Right? That you are part of the problem, part of the solution, part of the future. Right? So it's important that you understand your responsibilities to society. Right? Being a good consumer, being a good citizen. Right? All these are important aspects of how the world is going to be in the future. I really want to thank you guys all for a semester. I know it wasn't the easiest but I thank you for hanging in there, and I hope you've enjoyed the class. Good luck on the final.